Roaring 20s and the Great Depression. For many Americans, the Roaring 20s were a time of new prosperity and rapidly changing values. The soaring stock market reflected a get rich quick spirit and the belief that good times were here to stay. Factories no longer turned out supplies for the war, so now they could produce consumer goods that made life easier and more comfortable. Electricity was now supplied to many towns, making electric appliances practical and desirable. Americans quickly shifted from the icebox to the refrigerator and from carpet sweepers to electric vacuum cleaners. Department stores like Sears, Roebuck and Company sold a variety of consumer goods that people could just get. Automobiles also changed American life. People who owned cars could travel further to work. Cars ended the isolation of the farmers, and it made travel to faraway places enjoyable. Many members of the rapidly growing middle class bought these automobiles in the 1920s. The middle class especially benefited from the increased availability of the consumer goods. In 1920, the passage of the 19th Amendment, which gave the rights to all women to vote in the national and state elections. Women had a new sense of freedom, in which they reflected in their dress. A lot of them called themselves flappers, and they cut their hair short, and they wore makeup, and um, their dress was um, more I guess more flamboyant. Um, Despite the changes to the women's demeanor, they still lacked the same opportunities as men. If they did work outside the home, it was normally in a low paying job or a woman's work job, which could be teaching school or as a domestic servant. Um, Living standards were rising because manufacturing was becoming more efficient. The assembly line made the makings of cars quicker, and that was started by Henry Ford. To encourage consumers to buy goods, stores started offering credit. Credit made it possible for consumers to buy what they wanted, even if they did not have the cash to pay for it. During the 1920s, Americans were very optimistic about business, and those with money to share and to spare invested heavily in the stock market. Um, President Calvin Coolidge actually said the chief business of America is business. As stock prices soared, eager investors began using margin buying to purchase stocks. Uh, it meant that buyers paid just a part of the price of the stock and borrowed the rest through their stockbrokers. The stockbrokers then in turn borrowed it from banks. So eventually that comes back to harm them. The Great Migration happened when about 2 million African Americans left the South to settle in industrial cities in the Northeast, Midwest, and West. So that was between 1910 and 1930 or so. New York, Chicago, Detroit, and other northern cities had a high population of blacks residents come. The Harlem Renaissance was an outpouring of the creativity among African Americans. The writers, the artists, the musicians, they would gather in Harlem and create. Jazz became so popular in the 1920s that the decade is often referred to as the Jazz Age. In 1919, Anti-alcohol reformers succeeded in passing of the 18th Amendment, which prohibited or outlawed the making, consumption, and selling and transporting of alcoholic beverages. Um, this was actually called prohibition, but it made the selling and distributing of alcohol a big business. It was behind the scenes, and it was actually bootlegging. Popular culture was common to all the regions. Novelists also contributed to the print culture. American writers developed themes and styles that helped define modern literature. Um, Popularity of print was not the only thing. Radio became hugely popular and very influential in the 1920s. Movies became a big business. They started off in the 1920s with silent movies, and by 1927, The Jazz Singer was the first feature-length motion picture with sound. Very, very popular. They had more free time to spend on leisure activities, so going to the movies, watching sports, uh, baseball with Babe Ruth was huge. Um, College football, boxing, and wrestling matches were also attended by large crowds of people. But the Roaring Twenties also had a dark side. Not all Americans shared in that prosperous times and the wealth. Um, some of them even became victims of intolerance. Um, it was a divided decade, which had traditional and modern. Um, the post-war fear of radicals um, came around. Um, a fear of communism had the Red Scare, um, and little people had a campaign that with the government that anybody who spoke ill of the government ended up being thrown in jail or were suspected of being communist. Um, the Ku Klux Klan was revived. They had political power and they had mob violence against African Americans and immigrants and Catholics and Jews and anybody else that they felt was un-American. Um, Also, Congress limited immigration to the United States during this time. Um, American society in the 20s was deeply divided between traditionalist and modernist. Um, Defenders of the traditional morality complained that the behavior of the flaming youth and the flappers were ruining society. Old-time religion faced off against modern science. It was kind of a cultural war. Traditionalists and modernists clashed over issues of evolution. In 1925, there was a huge trial, the Scopes trial, where John Scopes, a teacher, was arrested for teaching his class a lesson on evolution. Tennessee state law was passed in 1925 that made it illegal in public school for them to speak about any part of the beginning of time that didn't teach the story of the divine creation, how it was taught in the Bible. So in 1925, he went on trial. The jury found him guilty. He had to pay a $100 fine, but it was more about him breaking the law. It was more of a debate over teaching evolution in public schools, and that still continues today. The economy ended up sinking into a depression. Starting on Thursday, October 24th, the stock market collapsed. It's known as Black Tuesday. It was the most disastrous day in the stock market's history up till that time. The economy ended up, the stock market affected millions and millions of Americans, some right away, but many over years to come. Many banks had invested heavily in the stock market. They had loaned money on margin. After the crash, people didn't have money to pay them back, and they didn't have money to pay their depositors, which were people who had put money into their bank. They went bankrupt or closed the door, so everybody lost their whole life savings. In 1930, more than 1,000 banks went out of business. Businesses lost their deposits when banks were closed. There was no one else willing to loan them money. Without those funds, then thousands of businesses also failed and went out of business. The stock market crash and the problems of the farmers were two of the main reasons that we went into a huge depression. Another problem was that millions of families had been left out of the prosperity of the 1920s, so they didn't have all those consumer goods, and where the banks had loaned out large sums of money to foreign nations, that they couldn't get the money back, also caused a greater depression. By 1933, more than 12 million Americans had lost their jobs. By the beginning of 1933, almost 1,000 families per day were losing their homes. For the first time, homelessness became a major problem in America. In 1932, President Hoover supported the creation of the government agency to save failing banks and businesses, and it was called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or the RFC. However, in July, he supported this bill, but it was allowed a variety of public works projects to help the needy, but even though with his efforts, it failed. And so the people of America decided they needed new leadership. And in the 1932 election, the Republicans nominated Herbert Hoover for a second term, but the Democrats chose the governor of New York, which was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt related the country's hardships to his own experiences. He had become paralyzed by polio at age 39, and he once stated, "Once I spent 2 years lying in bed trying to move my big toe. That was the hardest job I'll ever have to do. After that, anything else is easy." He won by a landslide. So Roosevelt began his presidency by targeting the bank crisis. During his first 100 days, he pushed Congress to deal quickly with the nation's problems. Congress passed 15 major bills, a record for that number of days. Most of his had to do with three goals: an immediate relief for the needy, economic recovery, and reform intended to keep such problems from developing in the future. That's huge. Together, that became his New Deal. His New Deal responded to the crisis with a series of ambitious government programs. The first one was the FERA, which was the Federal Emergency Relief Act. It gave money to states to help them provide food and assistance to people in need. Another one helped pay for useful public works, such as the building of bridges and lighthouses and schools and sewer systems, which helped provide jobs for thousands of people who were out of work. They were actually building up society, and in the process feeding themselves. To feed the hungry, soup kitchens sprang up everywhere. Also, a huge lasting part of the New Deal was the Social Security Act. It established a pay for people when they were older and they couldn't work any longer. So it virtually took care of our elderly. Farm prices had fallen to a point that farmers could not turn a profit when they harvested their products and they brought livestock to market. So 1/3 of them had lost their farms. So we no longer had people that were able to plant food for our growing nation. In response to that, they created the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which it paid farmers to plant less and raise fewer animals. The Banking Act of 1933, Roosevelt's plan to protect Americans from banking problems. This law created the FDIC, which is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. It guaranteed individual bank deposits up to $2,500, and that's still around today. Together, President Roosevelt and Congress set out to reform the stock market. A key step was the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, in 1934, which is still around today. The New Deal helped millions of Americans survive the Great Depression. It also permanently changed the role of the federal government. Americans were persuaded that the government had a responsibility to help people who could not help themselves. Also, they accepted an increase in government regulation of some parts of the economy. Despite the fact that the Great Depression still continued, the economy had improved and it made an even larger majority. He was re-elected in the next election. All over the country, the New Deal construction projects put the unemployed to work. The New Deal also introduced safety nets, Social Security, and unemployment insurance that still exists today. It helps the income for retired and unemployed workers. Welfare, training, and assistance programs to help those in need. Another lasting effect was the government became more involved in regulating the stock market and the banking industry. The FDIC still protects bank depositors by insuring bank accounts. Laws limit margin buying, and other rules forbid banks from taking risk in the stock market with depositors' funds. In 1939, most New Deal programs had come to an end, but his ambitious response to the Great Depression had permanently changed both the size and the role of the national government. By the end of the 1930s, most Americans were prepared to accept the government did have a responsibility to lend a helping hand to those in need. And as the 1940s began, the Depression still lingered, but it would finally be brought to an end by a new and even greater crisis. America would go to World War II.